So down on Cape Cod, where I'm from, we have plenty of scary stories to fill a whole night. We have ghosts and pirate captains and pugwudgies and sea serpents and a few devils hiding out there in the dunes. But when the sun sets over Buzzards Bay and the moon rises over Truro Sound, then the witches come out to ride. And that's the time to truly be scared. And there's no tale of a witch more worth telling than that of Hannah Screechum. The old people said she lived way out there on Great Head Island, amongst the dunes and the scrub pines, all alone. Now Hannah, she was the perfect specimen of a witch. Her face was cracked and scarred with the batterment of countless years, and her hair tangled and salt-caked with the constant push and pull of the northeast wind off the sea, was so dampened and twisted, crabs and oysters would crawl inside to find their home for the winter. Her clothes hung off her skeletal frame like great bat wings. And her smell, which always preceded her. There's nothing to compare it to, nothing to describe it, except that it was damp and dead and ancient. The old people said she could transform herself into a great black dog that would stalk the old King's Highway and the shorelines. Or else she would be a huge black crow and sit at the tops of the trees and watch travelers under her with a weary and evil eye. But what she was most famous for was the most nefarious kind of job that'll chill you to the bone. You see, Hannah kept foul company. Thieves, brigands and highwaymen, and pirates. The most famous of these was Captain Kidd. Hannah and Kidd had a terrible arrangement. And they played it out again and again, over and over. And it always went the same way, and it went like this. Kidd would cruise between the islands of the Caribbean and the Carolinas, picking up treasure from merchant ships and mission towns. And always, near the end of one of his ventures, he would find a new young crewman to take aboard his ship. And he would take him under his wing, and he would teach him all he knew, and he would call him son. And when they had gained as much treasure and blood as their holds could carry, he would tell his new young mate to make a heading straight for Cape Cod and Great Head Island. And when the ship pulled into the harbor off Great Head, Kidd would wait for the clouds to cover the moon. And he would take his young mate and he would tell him, son, here is your job. Take this chest of gold and riches, put it in the longboat, and row straight out to the beach. Once you get there, pull the boat up onto the shore and drag the chest as far as you can into the dunes until you can just barely hear the pounding of the waves on the shore. There you will find an old scrub pine, and there, under its roots, bury the treasure and come back to us. And this young sailor, he would be so excited that his new mentor had trusted him with such an important job. He would eagerly take up the chest, grab a shovel, pull them all into the boat, and into the darkness he rowed alone. No light to guide him, but he rowed straight and true right onto the shore, and he pulled up the boat, and he hauled the chest out of it, and so heavy he had to drag it across the sand and into the dunes. He dragged that heavy chest through that labyrinth of sand and rocks until finally, when he could just barely hear the pounding of the waves on the shore. He could just make out the outline in the dark of an old scrub pine, dead and twisted, its branches like broken fingers reaching up towards the moonless sky. And he would drop the heavy chest and he took up his shovel. And he plunged it into the sand right underneath the tree and he began to pull and dig. And as he moved the sand out of the way, he hit the roots of the tree. And they were thick and deep. And he pushed and pulled with his shovel as much as he could until he couldn't anymore. And he threw the shovel down and got to his knees. And he plunged his hands into those roots. They were hard and wet and thick. And he took them in his hands and he pulled and he pushed until the blood and the sweat ran together. And still he pulled. It seemed the deeper he got, the more roots there were. And the harder and wetter they became. They slipped through his fingers. And finally, as his hand reached beneath one of the biggest roots, he could feel the cold, round coins of kids' last treasures. And he knew he had found and dug enough to finally bury his own. As he looked around him, he realized he had dug himself into a great pit and the walls reached on either side of him. And he excitedly reached up for the treasure and then something changed. The air, maybe, it seemed colder, stiller. And a strange feeling crept over his skin, like spiders, crawling up his arms. He wasn't alone. Have you ever felt that? Though you feel, though you know there is no one around you, there is someone watching, just out of sight. And then it hit him. The smell. It was damp and dead and ancient. And just at that moment, clouds passed from the moon. And a single beam of light shone down onto his hands. And he saw that what he held, what he knelt into up to his waist were not roots, but bones. And as the smell grew thicker and the feeling crawling over his skin spread to his shoulders and down his chest and into his toes, he looked over his shoulder. And before he could scream, Hannah was there, pushing him straight into that pit. And before he could do a thing, she had filled the sides of the pit with sand, and the sailor was buried alive. Once she had done her terrible deed, Hannah went to the shore's edge, and she saw the lights of Kid's ship, and she let out a horrible shriek. The old people said it was something like between the dying call of a gull or the yowl of a feral cat, or maybe both, or maybe neither. Once she had let out loose this horrible scream, Kid knew that Hannah had done her work well, and a cut of the treasure would go to her, and he sailed on for more profit and more blood. Now this went on for a while, until one day Hannah, sitting alone in her hovel, by the smallest of fires, thought to herself, why should she have to wait for a measly cut of this treasure when she did all the work, when she knew where the treasure was buried? So, one night, when the cloud covered the moon, she put on her great salty cloak and she shook out the sand and the oysters and crabs all scattered amongst her feet, and she walked out into the darkness to that very tree with the branches that curled up to the sky. And she got to her hands and knees And she began to dig through the sand and the bones. And she dug and scratched and clawed her way through the earth until finally she reached those cold, round little pieces of gold. And then something changed. The air became colder and stiller, and a strange feeling like spiders crawling over her skin. She wasn't alone. And she looked over her shoulder, and there, surrounding the pit that she had dug, were the faces of all the men she had murdered. And as she gazed up at them, and as they looked down at her with vengeance in their eyes, the bones at her feet and in her hands rose and clutched onto her skin, her clothing, her hair, anything they could grab, and they dragged her down, shrieking into the pit. And as her final shriek pierced the air, the sides of the pit closed in, and Hannah was buried with her victims forever. But the old people still say that if you go out on a moonless night to the dunes of Great Head, the ghost of Hannah Screecham will be walking there still, piercing the night with her hellish shriek. So if you ever find yourselves out in those dunes and the clouds are covering the moon and the air goes cold and still, and a feeling like spiders crawls over your skin, look over your shoulder, because Hannah Screecham's face may be the last thing you ever see before she pulls you down beneath the sand where no one can hear you scream.